All right, so in our last explainer, we talked about Cecil Rhodes, right? He was the guy who drew the colonial blueprint. Well, today, we're going to get inside the mind of the man who built the fortress walls around that blueprint. And he built them brick by bloody brick. Now, this is a guy who never pulled a trigger himself. He went to church every single Sunday. And he died without a single ounce of repentance. This is the mind of PW Botha.
You see, here's the thing about Botha. He never, ever saw himself as the bad guy. Not for a second. In his own mind, and you got to remember, in the minds of a lot of his supporters too, he was this devout Calvinist, a patriot. He truly believed he was defending his people and their Christian values from what he called an atheistic, communist onslaught. And look, this wasn't just some political speech he was giving. For him, this was real. It was a deeply, deeply held belief.
But, and this is a huge but, there is just this brutal, absolute disconnect between how he saw himself and the cold, hard reality. So at the exact same time he's presenting himself as this defender of the faith, his government was running these secret, clandestine units. You might have heard of one, Vlakplaas. These were state-sanctioned death squads. They tortured and murdered anti-apartheid activists, and they did it with total impunity. He wasn't some soldier on the front lines. He was a bureaucrat of terror, signing the papers from behind a desk.
And if you don't believe me, listen to this. This is a direct quote from Eugene de Kock. He was the commander of that Vlakplaas death squad. He said, "The crucial thing was to get the job done. The question of whether what we did was legal or not did not come into the picture. The results were." Wow. I mean, that just lays the whole mindset bare, doesn't it? This wasn't some rogue operation. This was policy coming straight from the top. The ends justified any means. This was the dark heart of Botha's total strategy in action. Results, no matter the human cost.
So this all forces us to ask a really tough question. The central question of this whole explainer, really. Botha died back in 2006, and he was defiant right to the very end. He never, not once, acknowledged the monstrosity of what he did. So what are we looking at here? Was he just a monster who knew exactly what he was doing? Or, and this is maybe the more terrifying thought, was he something far more complex?
So, to try and get our heads around this, we're going to do a kind of psychological autopsy. We're going to peel back 4 layers. We'll start with his origins, then get into his belief system, look at the brutal strategy he used, and finally his unrepentant legacy. And we'll wrap it all up with a meeting that, believe it or not, changed everything.
All right, let's dive in. Layer 1, the survivor's son. Because look, to understand the man, you have to understand the wound that created him. Before all the politics, before the ideology, there was trauma. Okay, so to really get PW Botha, we have to rewind the clock, way back, to an event that happened 14 years before he was even born. During the Anglo-Boer War, his own mother was just a child when she was interned in a British concentration camp. I mean, just think about that. 26,000 Afrikaner women and children died in those camps. This became the foundational trauma for the entire Afrikaner identity. They didn't see themselves as colonizers, no. They saw themselves as survivors of a genocide at the hands of the English. And PW Botha was born directly into that story, that feeling of persecution. And this brings us to a really key concept from modern psychology, something called intergenerational trauma. You might have heard of the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He explains that trauma isn't just a bad memory or a story we tell ourselves. It's a physiological state. It lives in the body. And here's the wild part. A parent's trauma can literally shape how their child's brain and nervous system develop. It can pre-wire them to be constantly on the lookout for threats, to live with a baseline of anxiety. And I want to be really clear, this is not a metaphor. Botha's mother survived a concentration camp. The chronic stress, the fear, the loss, all of that lived inside her body. And it was transmitted to her son. It wired his nervous system for hypervigilance, for constant threat detection, for seeing the world as a simple us versus them battle. So before he ever had a single political thought, his body itself was trained to believe the world was a fundamentally hostile place. So you take this person whose nervous system is already wired for threat, and at age 20, he joins the National Party, and he never leaves. For his entire adult life, he lives inside this one single ideological bubble. Psychologists have a term for this, identity fusion. It means there's no separation between your personal identity and the group's identity. So for Botha, an attack on apartheid wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a personal attack, an existential threat. And that explains so much, right? Like his famous aggressive finger-wagging style. For him, disagreement wasn't a debate. It was an act of war against his very soul. Think about it. Rhodes was driven by ego, Leopold by greed, but Botha was driven by fear, a deep, inherited fear of being completely wiped out.
Okay, on to layer 2. If that trauma was the hardware of his mind, then his belief system was the software running on it. And this is where we really start to see why he was so much more dangerous than just some cynical tyrant.
There's this philosopher, Eric Hoffer, who came up with this term, the true believer. Now, a true believer isn't someone who's just using an ideology to get rich or famous. No, this is someone who has completely surrendered their own individuality to a cause they see as absolute, even holy truth. And what makes the true believer so dangerous is that their conscience never bothers them. Why would it? They don't think they're doing anything evil. They're convinced they are serving a higher good. PW Botha, he was a textbook true believer.
So what was his holy truth? Well, it was this toxic mix of Calvinist theology and Afrikaner nationalism. The Dutch Reformed Church, which was like the spiritual heart of the Afrikaner people, it literally taught that apartheid was God's will. So, separate development, as they called it, wasn't just a political policy, it was an act of theological obedience. Botha genuinely believed that by fighting the enemies of apartheid, he was fighting the Antichrist himself. And when you have that level of religious certainty, well, it's like a conscience silencer. It makes any atrocity seem permissible because you're just doing God's work.
You know, if you're looking for a philosophical model to understand his mind, you can't do better than Plato's allegory of the cave. Just picture it. Botha was born inside this cave, the cave of Afrikaner nationalism, and he spent his entire life chained up, forced to stare at the shadows flickering on the wall. And what were those shadows? They were the total onslaught from the communists, the existential threat to his people. And for him, those shadows were reality. He wasn't lying when he talked about these threats. He was just describing the only world he had ever known.
And we can stick with Plato for another second here. He had this model of the soul, divided into 3 parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Now, in a well-balanced person, reason is in charge. But in Botha, no way. His spirit was completely dominant. And by spirit, Plato meant that warrior energy, the defender of the tribe, the part of you that feels honor and rage. Botha's rational mind was sharp, for sure, but it was just a servant to that warrior's mission. And his appetite for power, it wasn't really for personal greed. It was all about fueling that righteous fight. He was what Plato would call a timocrat, a ruler from the warrior class.
Okay, time for layer 3. We've looked at the psychological hardware and the ideological software. Now, let's look at the brutal output, the methods his apartheid state used, a system he proudly called the total strategy.
So, the core idea of his government was this thing called total onslaught. This was basically the paranoid belief that every single form of opposition, I'm talking student protests, labor strikes, international sanctions, armed resistance, you name it, was all part of one big coordinated communist plot to destroy South Africa. And once you believe that, it reframes everything, doesn't it? A student protest isn't just dissent anymore, it's an act of war. And that level of paranoia, in his mind, justified a total strategy in response.
You can actually model this whole destructive logic with game theory. See, his total strategy created a perfect zero-sum game. Any tiny gain for Black South Africans was seen as a catastrophic loss for the state. And this way of thinking traps both sides in something called a Nash equilibrium. Basically, as you can kind of see from the chart, no matter what the other side chooses to do, your best move is always to escalate the conflict. So from inside that twisted logic, reform is irrational, negotiation is just a sign of weakness, the only possible outcome is this downward spiral of conflict. Botha literally built a trap that even he couldn't escape from.
And inside that trap, he had his instruments of control. First, he tried this sham reform, the tricameral parliament. It was this really cynical attempt to bring colored and Indian South Africans into the fold while completely excluding the black majority. Yeah, it fooled absolutely no one. So when that blew up in his face, he tried to play tough with his infamous Rubicon speech. The entire world was waiting for him to announce reforms. Instead, he gets on TV and basically wags his finger at everyone. The currency, the rand, collapsed overnight. So with his back against the wall, what does he do? He goes for raw power. A nationwide state of emergency, which just suspends the rule of law, and banning orders, a truly nasty tool that could just make a person disappear from public life, silenced without ever going to trial.
And right at the dark heart of this whole strategy was its most sinister secret, Vlakplaas. This was the ultimate expression of his system. It was a farm just outside Pretoria, where ordinary cops were systematically turned into assassins. It's like a real-world demonstration of that famous Stanford prison experiment, Zimbardo's Lucifer effect. It shows how a toxic system can get good people to do truly evil things. The evil wasn't just in the men pulling the trigger, it was baked right into the structure that Botha commanded. The same structure he used to authorize things like the bombing of Kotso House, which was the headquarters for the Council of Churches of all places.
To really understand the human cost of all this, we have to look at one case in particular, the murder of Steve Biko. This was in 1977. Botha was the Minister of Defense. Biko was arrested at a simple roadblock. The timeline here on the screen is stark, but the reality is just colder. For 13 days, he was systematically broken down. He was held naked, in chains. He was beaten so badly he went into a coma with extensive brain damage. And then his captors threw his broken body into the back of a Land Rover and drove him 1,200 kilometers to a prison that didn't even have medical facilities. He died there, alone, on a cold concrete floor. This was not an accident. This was the system working exactly as it was designed to.
And this brings us to Biko's most powerful insight. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So why was he so dangerous to a guy like Botha? He wasn't a general. He didn't have an army. He was a philosopher. He was the man who'd escaped Plato's cave and was coming back to tell everyone else the shadows weren't real. Biko understood that the real battle wasn't with guns. It was psychological. Apartheid's greatest trick was convincing black South Africans they were inferior, and Biko's philosophy of black consciousness was the antidote. He was a psychological threat, and that's the most dangerous kind of threat to a system like this, because you can't defeat it with guns. So they had to kill his body. They had to destroy him physically, because they could never, ever defeat his idea.
All right, let's get to our final layer of analysis, because the system that Botha perfected, it didn't die when he did. We need to look at its legacy and see how its toxic logic is still echoing in our world today.
So when you boil it all down, the ultimate conflict wasn't just political, it was philosophical. On one side, you've got Botha's system, that Platonic timocracy, ruled by the military and security guys. And on the other side, you have Steve Biko, the philosopher king, the man they killed because he'd seen the truth outside the cave. And this conflict didn't end with apartheid. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came along, Botha defiantly refused to apologize. And in stark contrast, the TRC offered this radical, beautiful African philosophical idea, Ubuntu, the belief that our humanity is all tied together and that the only way to heal a broken nation is through collective truth, not individual revenge.
And this is why looking at Botha's mindset is still so important. Because the architecture he built, the playbook he wrote, it got exported. The whole logic of total onslaught, defining some vague existential enemy to justify suspending civil liberties, mass surveillance, detention without trial, that became the blueprint for the global war on terror. His playbook for using the state broadcaster, the SABC, as a propaganda machine is still a model for authoritarian states today. And those structures of deniability he perfected in his state's Security Council, where no order is ever written down, leaders all over the world still use that exact trick to keep their hands clean.
And that brings us to our conclusion, to one single quiet moment that was like the crossing of a historical Rubicon, a meeting between two men who basically embodied this entire conflict. The date was July 5th, 1989. President PW Botha invites a prisoner to his official home for tea. Just think about that for a second. One man was the architect of the most sophisticated system of racial oppression the modern world has ever seen, and the other man was its most famous victim, a man who had spent 27 years locked away in its prisons.
And the meeting itself was apparently polite, almost surreal. Nelson Mandela even wrote later that Botha was quite charming. But don't be fooled, that quiet cup of tea triggered a political earthquake. Because by meeting with Mandela, the unshakable true believer had crossed his own personal Rubicon. He had legitimized his sworn enemy. For his hardcore followers, it was like the spell was broken. Within a single month, his own party turned on him and forced him to resign. And just 6 months after that, Nelson Mandela walked free.
And that's pretty much where PW Botha's story ends. He lived out his days in quiet, unrepentant retirement, still inside his own cave. But history was just getting started. We've dissected the system, and we've met the man who survived it. And that leads us inevitably to our next explainer, and the biggest question of all. After 27 years in a prison cell, what does a man decide to do with his freedom?
So we end up right back where we started. After this whole journey inside the mind of apartheid's last true believer, the question is still hanging there. What do you think? Was he a monster who knew exactly what he was doing, or was he something else entirely?
A man so trapped inside his own righteousness, so completely blinded by the shadows in his own cave, that he could never, ever see what had truly become.